So folks, welcome back to another Titans card review. This time around we got all the neutral cards, including the final neutral legendary. This is Kologarn, an 8-mana 6/10 with pretty tough to decipher text box, but we'll break it down. He's got Rush, and whenever this attacks a minion, put it in your hand, and then Death Rattle, move any in your hand to your opponents. So let me explain how this works. You plop down Kologarn, he's got Rush so he can attack right away. Let's say your opponent has a Sargeras the Destroyer, a big Titan on board. He's going to attack Sargeras, if you want, and that is going to remove Sargeras from play and put Sargeras into your hand. And because this is whenever this attacks and not after, Kologarn is not going to take any damage on that exchange. He will try to resolve the attack. It won't resolve. Sargeras will move to your hand. If Kologarn survives long enough, if you have enough mana, you can play that Sargeras. So maybe your opponent can't remove Kologarn. You go to the next turn. It's 9 mana. You've got Sargeras as a great follow-up. If your opponent is able to kill Kologarn before you're able to play the Sargeras, then the Sargeras is going to move to their hand. That is the Death Rattle portion of this card. So if Kologarn dies before you play the card, this is kind of a really expensive sap. Basically, you sapped that minion back to their hand for 8 mana, and of course force them to remove, a 10 health unit. Obviously, there's some stats to contend with here as well. But of course, if they can't deal with this, maybe you're playing against an aggro deck and they just don't have the ability to deal 10 damage to this easily, you might be able to keep generating additional instances of Kologarn's attacks, thereby getting more resources and removing more stuff really, really easily, and kind of using this to snowball to victory off of that. But it's a pretty weird card to break down for that regard. Ultimately, I look at this and I say, man, 8 mana is a lot for this kind of removal. And it scares me in particular because so many great cards in Hearthstone that you want to remove have like battle cries or effects that are valuable right when they're played. So for instance, Sargeras as an example, if you did want to remove your opponent's Sargeras, as soon as they got that back, they'd be able to replay Sargeras and get like another portal, for instance, generating even more imps. I'll let you debate whether you think 4 imps per turn and 2 portals is good, but you get the idea. Any sort of valuable battle cries that you remove, if the opponent's able to get those back, then you're just kind of in trouble, and you gave them an extra resource, an extra play, an extra way to play that card a second time. Obviously, there are other instances where you don't mind so much if they have to spend mana to replay something, but it's got some risk and downside inherent to it because of the fact that you're just kind of giving it back to them a majority of the time. And I say a majority of the time because I think if you're playing this card on turn 8, it's probably in a grindier matchup, a control v control scenario, where you're trying to extract additional value. And in those matchups, I think most people will be able to deal with Kologarn pretty readily. I don't think you're as excited to play this card against like an aggro deck on turn 8. Number one, they might just have too many minions on board and this just doesn't do enough. But number two, there's just better and bigger ways to stabilize in that kind of matchup than something like Kologarn. This isn't really the shape of card that helps you stabilize on turn 8. You're looking for like some healing or some last ditch removal or survivability to just barely scratch by. And I don't think Kologarn does that with removing a single unit for 8 mana on that first turn. So, this card's just kind of weird, right? It's just really expensive as a setup for what it does. And I think the scenarios where it's best probably come along a little bit too rarely. It might need additional support. Like, yeah, okay, if you could give it like stealth or something, sure. Maybe the 10 health is enough to get it there, but I don't think so. I think most decks are going to feel like they have better, more proactive things to do, more decisive removal, cheaper saps, basically, than Kologarn. So I like this card a lot. It looks cool and stuff, but I don't think it gets there usually. So moving on here, we have the Disguised Kathir. This is a new 5-mana 3/3 neutral. Each turn this is in your hand, transform it into a random card in your opponent's deck. So this is kind of like a Chameleos, the old priest card. That, though, would transform into something in your opponent's hand, which I think was notably better because it gave you both reconnaissance information and it gave you, the same amount of basically resource. So the fact that it's in their hand, like, okay, they have this card right now. This might be something they play. The fact that it's in their deck, that could be at the bottom of the deck. That might be a card you never see. So it doesn't have quite as much reconnaissance upside. You're not learning quite as much about your opponent's potential plays, which I think that is definitely a notable downside because Chameleos never really proved to be that great of a card. And for the same reasons, I don't really think Disguised Kathir is going to be that great of a card either. Usually your opponent's stuff is just worse than you running a card you know is going to work. There are some like thievery upsides for certain decks like Priest or Rogue maybe. There's technically some stuff for like Rainbow Mage, or maybe you could get spell types of your opponent's spell types instead of yours, like against a druid you get some nature spells or something, but that still seems pretty iffy as well. So definitely a super fun card. We always like these kinds of things, but I don't think it's going to be nearly consistent enough, and the fact that its deck might actually be even a little bit worse than Chameleos, a card that was already not so great. Moving on to the Rune-Fueled Golem, a new 4-mana 4/4 with Battlecry. Discover a weapon from any class. So a lot of like neutral, like get a thing cards in Titans so far, and this is not the last one we're going to see in this video either. It's fine, this seems like nuts in arena sort of thing. Just get a body and get something to play. It's standard. I think this lacks any of the sort of synergies you require to be in a good deck. It's just too fair, just too honest. Weapons, like, yeah, getting access to them in other classes can sometimes be useful. Like, oh, can Druid do something broken with a weapon? Historically, it could. Maybe not so much anymore. It seems like they keep a closer eye on that now since nerfing Twig and such. So I don't really expect any weird shenanigans or craziness here out of the Rune-Fueled Golem. Ultimately, that 4-mana overhead for a pretty weak body doesn't make whatever weapon you're going to get worth it as an upside. When you randomly generate this sometimes, sure, free bonuses, free stuff, but most classes will have better things to do for 4 mana. Moving on to the Angry Hellhound, a 4-mana 2/5 beast with Rush and has +4 attack on your turn. So this is a 6/5 Rush when you play it, which of course means you can trade it into bigger stuff, and then when it's left behind, it doesn't take great trades on defense. Your opponent can trade some 3/3s into it and basically value trade it with that only 2 attack. But if it does stick around, of course, you can push 6 again to the face. Ultimately, 6/5 in stats is just still not good enough. Like, there are just way faster, more aggressive sorts of minions if you're looking for that kind of damage. And the downside here that this is so tradable, if you did have to play this proactively and didn't get to take a trade, your opponent can deal with it pretty easily with that low attack value of sorts. So I don't know what deck needs this. Any sort of beast synergies, Hunter has better plays, faster things to do, more synergistic lines. So Angry Hellhound here, again, looks like a great arena card, but probably not worth it in standard. So the Starlight Whelp, here's another one of those get a card sort of cards. And I like this one. Actually, this looks pretty good. It's a 3-mana 4/3 dragon with Battlecry. Get a random card from your starting hand. So this basically allows you to duplicate up on resources. So you've got, the top 28 cards in your deck that you like a lot. Instead of running, card 29 and 30 that might be a little bit weaker, you could kind of run 2 Starlight Whelps to make sure you're getting those better cards, extra copies of those. Now, it does come at a 3-mana cost, and not all decks, of course, would want to sustain that 3-mana cost. You're looking to be more aggressive, you don't have time to play a 3-mana 4/3, but any deck that's playing a little bit slower, greedier game plan, of which we've seen a few of those, Blood DKs, Control Priests, some grindier mages, then Starlight Whelp might actually serve as a good option, particularly if there are any reasons to have dragon synergies or, minion type bonuses like that. So maybe even menagerie type stuff. So, I'm not saying every deck forever would run this, but if there are particularly punchy cards you could get out of this, or if it has some other meaningful upside because it's a dragon, seems like a great choice. So pretty flexible and interesting little resource generator here for control decks, I think. Moving on to the Celestial Projectionist. This is a 2-mana 3/2 with Battlecry. Choose a friendly minion and add a temporary copy of it to your hand. So this is an interesting card. I look at this and at first I was like really excited, like, oh man, extra copies of my stuff. That's insane. I love that so much. But I do think the temporary aspect of this makes the Celestial Projectionist a little more awkward to play, right? In essence, you're gonna have to, if it's something big and awesome in particular, like a big Titan, for instance, it's gonna have to have stuck on board for the Celestial Projectionist to really make sense. Because if you spend 6 mana on a Titan and you play the Projectionist on the same turn, that's 8 mana spent. If you want to play that temporary Titan, that's another 6 mana. I guess, you know, that's too much. You can't do it in the same turn without some kind of discounts or shenanigans, right? So you're talking about pretty small minions, or pretty late in the game even, to get small minions all done in one turn. There are some really specific examples that look good. So for instance, like a 2 mana Astalor you could play, Celestial Projectionist, get another 2 mana Astalor, play it. That's a 6 mana play that gets you like a bunch of Astalors in hand. That sort of thing's cool, but how often is that going to line up? How often does the Projectionist sit dead in hand and prove to be a pretty clunky card? So I thought this looked really good at first glance, but as I break down actual game scenarios where this might work, I get far less interested in it. I don't think it actually looks as good as I hoped. There might still be some deck that finds it's worth it with some really cheap card that's just amazing to copy, like an Astalor. If there's enough critical mass of those, maybe the Projectionist is worth it, but otherwise, I think this just gets a little bit too clunky because of that temporary downside. It's going to be hard to extract enough out of it. So next up here is Ancient Totem, a 0 mana 0/3 totem, which actually seems kind of okay for me for Totem Shaman. That's been a sleepy tier 2 deck basically throughout this entire last meta, and it might stay that way. And I think slotting a card like this in wouldn't hurt too much. With so many different ways to buff totems and really build out some gigantic totem boards, having a way to do another bonus totem at 0 cost is basically going to help you shore up that board even more. You know, it could prove to be too low value just because there are plenty of other ways to summon totems in that deck. You know, you can spend like 1 mana to get 4 totems, but if the deck needs to lean a little bit more aggressively and get totems down even faster, this can be another way to discount your big payoff cards like your Gigantotem or Thing from Below really, really quickly and push those out sooner while still developing a totem that itself can also get buffed. So I wouldn't sleep on this one. I don't think it's a guarantee for that deck, and that deck may not hold up super well into a new meta, but definitely something to keep in mind as a possibility. Moving on here, I think we have the best looking mech so far for an aggressive mech deck. This is the Drone Deconstructor, a new 1 mana 1/2 mech. With a battle cry, get a 1/1 magnetic spark bot with a random bonus effect. And those bonus effects are basically just going to be the various keywords in Hearthstone right now. I've included 3 examples here that I think are probably the best: Lifesteal, Wind Fury, and Divine Shield. But there are 8 effects total, so you're not that likely. Sometimes you're going to low roll with like Taunt or something that you're maybe not as excited about. And Taunt might be okay sometimes too. But you know, Rush, Taunt, gosh, let me just pull them up so I make sure I get them all. Rush, Taunt, Reborn, Poisonous, Stealth, and that's everything with the ones on board or on screen. So you know, some good options, right? All of those are going to prove useful. I think the important part though is just that it's a 1/1 magnetic that gives you some great curve fill flexibility, but also a cheap way to utilize that magnetic payoff card that we saw earlier. In particular, you know, like hit that thing with Divine Shield, it's going to get +1/+1 off the magnetic. It's going to buff itself by +1/+1. And like, boom, that's off for the races. You're getting some really aggressive mech starts going. So yeah, I think this looks like a fundamental building block basically for any mech deck. I think this card's probably going to be included. I'm still not super confident that mechs are good enough in total right now, but we haven't seen class cards yet. So if some class in particular gets a nice mech package, it feels like Drone Deconstructor is going to be a part of that. So next up here, we have the Imposing Anubisath, a 4 mana 7/7. What? It's a 4 mana 7/7. It's a meme. We all laugh. It's got Taunt and can't attack. So this is a big defensive wall, basically, if you want to plop this down in the mid game against minion-based decks in particular. Maybe this eats a few bodies and you're happy. My thoughts are that usually decks have better ways to sweep up cards in the mid game or advance a synergy-based game plan in some way that most decks probably aren't quite as excited about the Imposing Anubisath. I feel like he may not go far enough. It's just so many small minions trade so well these days and can clean this up, and like, oh, it just died to a couple Divine Shield hits and I didn't really do anything sort of problems for cards like this one. So I don't think as a like just 4-drop wall is it good enough. There are other angles, maybe some things like Silence Priest. If you have ways to like copy this really affordably or something, it's possible that this card has some angles So, it's not a totally hopeless thing, but without real synergies and without being driven towards a more specific game plan, I don't think it gets there as a general use case taunt. Moving on to the Relentless Warg, a 3-mana 2/4 beast with Rush, and after this attacks and kills a minion, restore this to full health. The problem is with 2 attack, this will never kill minions, which sounds silly, but a lot of minions have 3+ health these days, which it makes this, I think, a pretty hard sell on turn 3. It's just not going to trade into that many things that well, and the stat line here is not compelling at all. The fact that it has Rush isn't that interesting. No additional upsides. This card just looks more or less unplayable to me. Like, theoretically, some buffs and stuff you could feed into this, but why? There are other cards you could buff as well that probably just do things cooler and bigger and better. So at the end of the day, this looks pretty bad. Moving on to the Trog Exile. This is a 3-mana 4/4 that actually kills stuff. It also has Rush, so maybe you can actually kill things with this card. This has the Battlecry, deal 4 damage to your hero, which for most decks would be a notable downside, but I think it's one that you can sustain if you're happy enough to take some good early trades and get a threat down in particular. So, this card's intriguing. I do think, 3-mana 4/4 is actually not as compelling as it would have been in eras past. We saw so many nulls coming down as 0-mana 3/5s. That felt good. Does a 3-mana 4/4 feel comparable with an actual downside to boot? I don't think so. I don't think this keeps up. Probably a monster arena card once again with a lot of these neutrals. That's the sort of thing we see. It's fine for these cards to exist and operate in those spaces, just not a card I think is likely to be played in standard. So next up here is the Tram Operator, a 5-mana 4/4 mech. Battlecry, it's going to draw you a mech, and then the next mech you play costs 2 less. So this is another one of those kind of mid-game mechs, much like the Legendary we looked at yesterday, that's kind of refilling your hand, maybe helping you push for a second or third wave of mechs. I mean, there are enough of these coming together that I'm like paying attention a little bit, but they still all feel so weak individually that I just don't know how it gets there. Like, I'm playing a 5-mana 4/4. Maybe I get a mech I can play alongside it immediately, but that's still not good. Like, a 2-drop mech next to this is not going to be that exciting ultimately. And then I got my 6-drop mech that does the same sort of thing, getting me some resources with some discounts. It just feels like you're kind of plodding along instead of making really decisive big swings or big board developments, and I just don't see how that keeps up. It feels like it's just too middling, too slow, too just like little incremental gains all at once, or little incremental gains over time, instead of playing things all at once and overwhelming opponents and creating these really big opportunities. So I just doesn't look that good to me. Now, that said, this card might have a secondary approach, which is not in a mech deck, but if you have a specific mech you're looking to tutor, say, you've got Voltron Prime and Rogue or something, and you really want to get that down cheaper, and, so on and so forth. This could be a way to find your Voltron Prime specifically. So using this as a mech tutor, other classes might have a specific mech they're looking to hit, and this is a way to get that out of your deck quicker, and then also discount it. So, particularly if you have a big, awesome mech to cheat, this could be a really powerful sort of play in that regard. So I don't think this is good in a mech specific deck, but cards like this you always have to keep an eye on as a bit of a mech tutor. Who knows if that possibility will show up, but something certainly to pay attention to, because that can be very powerful in those cases. So next up here we have the Serenite Tol'vir. He's a 4-mana 3/5 taunt, Sinjin Shieldmaster vibes. But he's got a nice bonus. Whenever this is attacked, draw a card. So I think you're dreaming that your opponent has 5 1/1s on board that they have to trade into the Serenite Tol'vir, and this draws you 5 cards, which of course that would indeed make this insane. Could be a risk in some cases, but usually you'd be pretty excited about that. I think the far more likely outcome is 2 things. Number one, this dies for free. Like, it doesn't draw any cards. Your opponent uses some kind of removal spell and just goes away, and you never drew anything out of it, which sucks. Or alternatively, maybe they kill it with a couple trades, a couple 3/3s, for instance, might run into this, and it draws you 2 cards, which that definitely still feels good. Like a 4-mana taunt that takes a couple trades and draws 2 cards, that would be a good result. I think the question, though, is with a card like this, the card draw is delayed, which, number one, you always prefer card draw to be instant if you can, because sometimes you're late in the game, you need stuff now. Playing the Serenite Tol'vir down, you're not going to get any cards now. It's going to be another turn later until you do. And then also you need your card draw often to work very consistently. And in a lot of matchups and a lot of board states, this just isn't going to work all that well. it's going to go away for free and your card draw will have whiffed. I don't think most decks can tank that low side. The upside's there, but you need to bring up the floor on this card to be good enough for a lot of decks. They need to know that the card draw is reliable if they're going to run that card in their deck and take up that slot. It's just not going to be worth it. The one angle I could see for this is maybe a taunt based deck. We've seen a lot of like Taunt Warrior. The bigger this gets, the more likely it is to do some crazy reloads and card draws. So maybe an angle in Taunt Warrior sort of stuff, but otherwise I think most decks that would otherwise happily run this, control decks, defensive decks, probably just need a little bit more consistency than this can offer. Next up is the Flame Revenant, a 2-mana 2/3 elemental. After you summon an elemental, give it +1/+1. So a little bit of an elemental board builder here. This reminds me a lot of the 2-mana 2/3 magnetic synergy card that we saw yesterday. And I think it has a lot of the same problems. It's just one of those that you have to get down and snowball off of it early to make it worth it. But at 3 health, it's hard for that to stick. And if you play this too late in the game, you know, you try to get this down on turn 4, 5, 6 or whatever, alongside another card, it's just not going to get enough stats fast enough to make an impact for a game plan that clearly cares about stats on board and probably a more aggressive line. So I think this lives in a similarly awkward space, and unfortunately for this one, we don't even have an elemental package really to keep this around right now. The mechs and magnetic stuff that we saw yesterday, like that's a whole thing for this expansion, so that gives me a little more hope. Will Flame Revenant even get support before it rotates? Probably some elementals here and there, but will an entire deck come together? And then even if it does, I still worry about whether this effect is actually worth it or not. So next appears the Ravenous Kraken, and kind of like this card. 3-mana 2/5 beast, Battlecry, destroy a friendly minion, and Death Rattle, summon a copy of it. So I actually think this is a great little Death Rattle synergy card. If you have some Death Rattles that you need to activate, the Kraken can do that and then give you that card back on the back end while still developing a 2/5 body. That's nothing to scoff at with that 5 health. I mean, it does delay your Death Rattle, but still, you're often very happy to just keep some stats floating around in a lot of decks. So, you know, hitting eggs, hitting any kind of great Death Rattle stuff on turn 2, using this even later in combination with a bomb or something all at once. There are a handful of different ways this thing can get a lot of value. I think this is ultimately a pretty big effect for 3 mana. Nice little stat line to go with it, and plenty of Death Rattle synergies to explore both now and later for this card. So this looks really good. Moving on to the Victorious Vrykul, a 1-mana 1/2. that reads, after this attacks, get a 2/3 Valkyr that costs 1. So nice little aggressive start to a game here. You get your 1 drop off the Vrykul, and then when it gets through, you get another 1-mana 2/3, which you're happy about just to play a little later, get some more bodies down. I don't know that this quite goes fast enough, though. I mean, ultimately 1/2s don't keep up that well. There's so many ways for this to die early and then not get the attack. And then even if it does, a 1-mana 2/3 that's not synergistic, that's, you know, maybe even a little awkward on curve sometimes on turn 2, that's iffy. And then if this comes down any later than turn 1, like you're trying to play this on turn 4 or 5, this card is probably hot garbage, way too easily dealt with, far unlikely to attack. And there are so many other 1-drops that present a more immediate threat, that scale, that have some kind of more direct upside, that this one feels just a little bit too delayed and too clunky to actually be worth it. Kolagarn is a 2-star card. Disguised Kathir is a 2-star card. Refueled Golem is a 2-star card. Angry Hellhound is a 1-star card. Starlight Whelp is a 4-star card. Celestial Projectionist is a 2-star card. Ancient Totem is a 3-star card. Drone Deconstructor is a 4-star card. Imposing Anubisath is a 2-star card. Relentless Warg is a 1-star card. Trog Exile is a 2-star card. Tram Operator is a 3-star card. Serenite Tolvir is a 2-star card. Flame Revenant is a 2-star card. Ravenous Kraken is a 4-star card. Victorious Vrykul is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this particular card review. Tons of neutral cards to talk about. Which one of these do you think are sleepers? Which ones do you think will get played? Are most of these just arena fodder? I want to hear all those thoughts and more in the comments below. Thanks much as always for watching. Stay tuned for a bunch of class card reviews coming soon. And until next time, game on.